Welcome to the Hunter Baumgardt Sports Podcast. My name is Hunter Baumgardt, your host. You can follow me on Twitter and Instagram at HunterBOnAir. Feel free to like and subscribe to both the YouTube and the SoundCloud channels. You can watch on YouTube or listen on SoundCloud, whichever is convenient for you. You just subscribe there and just search Hunter Baumgardt Sports Podcast. Today is kind of the farewell episode-ish. We are putting the Hunter Baumgardt Sports Podcast on pause. If you noticed, last week we didn't have an episode. This week I wanted to do kind of a recap / farewell episode as things are changing into the new year, right? We're headed into 2021. I started this podcast back in early March. I think March 6th was my first podcast when I did kind of a sneak peek episode. Since then, we've completed 44 different podcasts. And I say we because it's been me, it's been you, it's been all the guests that we've had. And so this has been a whole lot of fun to go through what has probably been the strangest year in all of our lives in a podcast form, and week to week have different guests. I tried to have relevant guests each and every week. I tried to have, whether when the NFL draft was going on, maybe, I had the Colton Bartholomew of who covers the Badgers, who tried to get a spring practice update there when things were shutting down. Had Dave Carney, the WKTY morning show host, on when sports pause, kind of went to him and thought, okay, put this in kind of you've covered sports for a long time. I'll put this in kind of a perspective. Then as everything kind of went on, I was fortunate enough to get connected with some of the top sports personalities in the state and some of the most down-to-earth sports personalities that we see on TV and hear on the radio every single day. Brian Anderson was one. It was fascinating to talk to him about his plans for going in the NBA bubble, his plans for calling Brewers games without any fans. We also talked with many, many other just sports radio hosts, whether they're from Milwaukee or from Madison. There were so many that we talked to, and it was really fun for me, obviously, being in the radio profession, the sports media profession here in Wisconsin, to talk to all these people. But also, I hope it was interesting to you, and I bet it was as well, kind of the behind the scenes of radio, of TV, because there was a big pause there. There were people who weren't doing shows, or there were people who weren't calling sports, like a Brian Anderson, like a Jeff Levering. And so we were able to get them and kind of say, okay, take us behind a day in the life of a usual day when everything was normal. What was it like to call games? And of course, Jeff Levering, we talked to during the Brewers season, which was a whole lot of fun. He's, of course, one of the announcers on the Brewers radio network. So we had so many guests. Of course, our first kind of bigger guest was Olivia Harlan Decker and Sam Decker. That was a fascinating interview. I encourage you to go back if you have time or are looking for some entertainment as we start this new year. Go back and look at some of these episodes because, I just asked the questions and then the entertainment, comes from the guests, because it was a lot of fun to ask different questions, like I said, behind the scenes, but also what they were up to when sports pause, what it's like, especially when I had Olivia and Sam on the same podcast and talked to them about, Sam plays overseas. How does that work? With Olivia working here in the U.S. So it was fascinating, and I hope you enjoyed it as much as I. The reason we are putting the Hunter Baumgardt Sports Podcast on pause is because I have accepted a position at WJJQ in Tomahawk, Wisconsin, where I'll be doing play-by-play. I'll be the voice of the Tomahawk High School there, all their different sports, whether it be football, basketball, baseball, but of course some other sports as well, like wrestling, hockey, etc. I'm super excited. Also be hosting a show there as well, and hosting a music show, if you will, as well too. So a bunch of different things. Super excited to stay in the sports radio landscape here in Wisconsin. I'm really excited to do that because, I love Wisconsin sports. And like Chuck Freeman said a couple of weeks ago on this podcast, a lot of us who cover the teams are fans. And that's what, if you say you're not a fan of the team you're covering, it's hard not to be. It's hard to not cheer for the team that you're covering. So I am excited to continue to talk Wisconsin sports and host a show there, which I'll put on my social medias at Hunter B on Air and the Hunter Baumgardt Sports Facebook page as well. And so I'll put it all, when that'll be, but also I'll be, calling sports, which I'm super excited to do. And of course, when sports are going on. But, and this podcast, I may bring it back once a month. I'm not exactly sure how it's going to fit yet, but I appreciate all of the support and everybody who has watched or watched on YouTube, listened on SoundCloud, because it's been a whole lot of fun and a way to stay connected to sports during this past year, a way to continue to talk to different personalities and get their take on what's going on in the sports world, because we were all going through this together, really. None of us had experienced this, and so it was fun to talk to them about their experiences. So I hope you enjoyed the episodes. Like I said, I'm saying we're putting the Hunter Baumgardt Sports Podcast on pause because who knows, might incorporate it up there in Tomahawk as well. The studio might look different, but would be really fun to do this podcast while everything is kind of going to be normal again, hopefully in the next year or so. So with no further ado, I usually say with no further ado, here is our guest. Well, no guest today. With no further ado, I will be putting this podcast on pause. Again, thank you so much to everybody who's watched or listens. Thank you to all of our guests. Like I mentioned some there, but there were so many others that have joined me. Over 30 guests have joined me on this podcast, including our latest episode, which I'd highly recommend. If you know the Twitter account, Freezing Cold Takes, I'd highly recommend going to that Twitter account. It has over like 430,000 followers. And I had a couple of weeks ago, I had the owner of that account on the podcast, and it was really interesting to hear how he runs that account. So if you've seen that on Twitter, you probably have to be on Twitter in order to kind of be interested maybe in that. But it's a fascinating account, followed by the likes of Adam Schefter and the top people in sports media. So it's a fascinating account, and it was a really interesting interview to kind of get behind the scenes. So that was the latest podcast, but this will of course now be the latest podcast. We're putting the podcast on hold. May do more, may not, but either way, if you want to follow me and my adventure up to northern Wisconsin, feel free to follow me on Twitter and Instagram at Hunter B on Air. That is where I'll put my future shows, what games I'm doing, etc. If you are interested. Otherwise, again, thanks so much for supporting this podcast throughout the year of 2020. It was wild. I started, the first podcast was published 11 days before Wisconsin kind of shut down, and so I was not expecting, when I started on March 6th and talked about Yelich signing an extension with the Brewers, to be talking about a bunch of off-the-field things, we talked about the social justice issues with Tyler Bain, my great friend. And so we did so much with this podcast, and it was really fun. So thanks a lot for watching or listening. I'll talk to you soon. And as always, stay positive.